Hello, this is Fluttershy. Welcome to my explosive book readings. And for this episode, I'm going to be reading Mr. Noisy. And I'm going to a wedding soon, so I'll probably read this explosive book. And I'll think I'll wheeze in your explosive chicken nuggets to get your KFC. Let's read Mr. Noisy's book. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy were reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice, and the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room, but achoo! when Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed in his bedroom in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. KFC. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Well, later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above wobbled. It's just a real minute. My hair is a mess. Okay. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clomp, clomp, clomp. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door. He opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread. Boom, Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crow, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crow trembled and sort of a laugh. Wait a minute. Are you referencing Mr. Thomas English's wife? This is not Mr. Thomas English's wife. That's a baker wife. KFC. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clomp, clomp, clomp. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut. I'd like a piece of meat. Boom, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and saw some meat. I told you, those nasty explosive commercials. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew to a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you had the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down to Wobbletown. Clomp, clomp, clomp. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread. He boomed. Sorry, what did you say? asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread. Roared Mr. Noisy. I can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crow. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat. Roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon, said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home. Went to bed hungry. Actually, showing my finks in the screen is actually more explosive. The day after Mr. Noisy tried again, he went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice. I'd like a loaf of... And then he stopped. And then he thought. He said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb's uncertainty, she said. Then Mr. Noisy went to Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something, Mr. Bacon? Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. I said I'd like a... And he stopped, and he thought, and then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled my pleasure, he said. This is explosive. So carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. Clop, clop, clop. Then he stopped, and then he thought, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door. Then he stopped, and then he thought, and then do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside. And then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before. That was fun too. Do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy ain't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. Do you know something else? This ain't right. Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. What? You cannot read the make if you don't have to stop doing your go. How could you ever expect? Why is it so extinct like the KFC? Oh my gosh. One of my favorite Mr. Men books. If you work, why would choke on your cake? Stop choking on your Coke. Do not sneeze on Coke. This explosive comment. Where are you going to go to the wedding? Because this book is full of donuts. No. Don't.